Hey, what's up, friends, and welcome back to the channel. Today we're stepping into a concrete box under Berlin, where a man who once commanded an empire sat shaking in a chair and whispered four words that ended a war. Just four words. You're going to want to hear this. There's an old saying soldiers used to whisper on the Eastern Front in those final months. The empire dies, but the paperwork keeps coming. By late April of 1945, that paperwork had become a joke. Generals were typing battle reports that described cities already in flames. Ministers were signing decrees for ministries that no longer had buildings. And at the center of it all, in a bunker 2 stories beneath a bomb-scarred garden, a 56-year-old man with a tremor in his left hand was receiving those reports each morning as if everything still made sense. Spoiler, it did not. This is the story of the day the illusion finally cracked. April 27th, 1945, and trust me, by the end of this video you'll understand exactly why that single afternoon matters more than almost any battle you've ever heard of. And hey, if stories like this one keep you up at night in the best possible way, consider subscribing. We go deep on moments that textbooks only glance at. By the morning of April 27th, the map of the Third Reich had become what military historians politely call a geographical fiction. Let's translate that into normal human language. It was a lie drawn on paper. The Soviet First Belarusian Front under Marshal Georgy Zhukov and the First Ukrainian Front under Marshal Ivan Konyev had finished closing the noose around Berlin on April 25th. To the south, General Theodore Bussy's Ninth Army was being shredded in what became known as the Halby Pocket, tens of thousands of soldiers surrendering or dying in fields that smelled of burning grass and gasoline. To the west, the American Ninth Army under General William Simpson and the British Second Army under General Miles Dempsey had reached the Elbe River and actually linked up with Soviet troops at a town called Torgau on April 25th. The photographers loved that handshake. The generals knew what it meant. The Reich was finished from every direction. Inside Berlin itself, General Helmuth Weidling was commanding what remained, somewhere between 80,000 and 100,000 soldiers drawn from the Volkssturm, basically old men and boys pressed into service, Hitler Youth units, broken Wehrmacht regiments, and scattered SS formations. They were deployed in 3 defensive rings around the city center, and each ring was thinner than the last. Weidling knew the math. He knew how many bullets he had, how many tanks he had, how many hours of food he had. None of those numbers were enough. He kept fighting anyway because the order to stop had not come, and because in this particular army, you did not stop until the order came from one specific room. That room was about 100 feet below the garden of the old Reich Chancellery. The Führer bunker had been built starting in 1943 and expanded through 1944 by an architect named Leonard Gall and his student Bunker.What. Picture 2 levels of reinforced concrete, walls up to 3.5 meters thick at the key points, with 30 small rooms, low ceilings, dim yellow lights that flickered when the diesel generators coughed, and a permanent chill of around 12 to 14 degrees Celsius. Ventilation came through a disguised garden exit. Water was pumped in from the Spree River through a system that leaked and rattled. The sound of distant artillery rolled through the concrete like a bad drum solo that never stopped. By April 27th, Soviet guns were somewhere between 5 and 8 kilometers from the Chancellery, which in artillery terms is essentially close enough to say hello. Now, here's the thing you have to understand about the morning of April 27th. Adolf Hitler was still being shown maps every single day. Colonel Friedrich Beryl of the OKW, the Supreme Command of the Armed Forces, and his small staff prepared these maps each night and brought them down before breakfast. And these maps were, how do I put this gently, absolute fantasy. They showed exaggerated blue defensive lines holding firm. They showed divisions still in position that had actually been destroyed weeks earlier. They showed General Bussy's Ninth Army to the south as if it were a menacing threat to the Soviet flank, when in reality it was dying by the hour. Generals Hans Krebs and Wilhelm Burgdorf would walk Hitler through these pictures, pointing at colored arrows, sounding confident. Himmler's liaison Hermann Fegelein added stories about fresh Waffen-SS units being assembled in Saxony and Bohemia, units that existed mostly on paper and in someone's imagination. Hitler's personal pilot, Hans Bauer, kept insisting that Tempelhof airfield was still usable for evacuation, even though Soviet shells had been landing on it since April 24th. Everyone in that room had a reason to keep the delusion alive. Some were afraid. Some were careerists. Some genuinely could not process that their world was ending. But the result was the same. The man at the head of the table was being lied to, and he was allowing himself to be lied to, because the truth was simply too large to fit inside the room. And then the truth walked in anyway. Hitler had, on April 22nd, during one of his now infamous screaming fits, ordered a man named Felix Steiner to assemble a relief force from scattered SS and Wehrmacht units and strike southward from the town of Eberswalde toward Berlin's northern flank. Steiner was supposed to be the miracle. Steiner was supposed to be the cavalry coming over the hill. On the afternoon of April 27th, Steiner's message reached the bunker. The message was short. The message was devastating. Steiner reported that he had insufficient forces to carry out the operation. In other words, there was no cavalry. There was no miracle. There was nothing. Witnesses who were in the conference room, Bergdorf, Krebs, the adjutant Wilhelm Johann Meyer, and later lead form Otto Gunsch and Traudl Junge, describe what happened next in slightly different words but with exactly the same picture. Hitler's face went white. Then it went red. His body began to shake. He sank back into his chair, and he said, very quietly, for words that the bunker community would never forget, "Then everything is lost." Some witnesses said he repeated the phrase. Some said he stared at the map for a long time without speaking. The secretaries later wrote that it was the first moment they understood in their bones that the end was no longer a theory. It was a calendar appointment. Let that sit for a second. A man who had commanded the largest military machine in European history sat in a concrete room, looked at a map, and realized the machine had no parts left. The fuel was gone. The drivers were gone. The roads were cut. And the enemy was walking toward him on foot because the roads were already taken. After the Steiner collapse, something interesting happened. Interesting in the worst possible way. Hitler did not flee. He did not call for a new plan. He did not convene a war council to discuss surrender terms or a defensive perimeter in the mountains. He withdrew. He retreated into a smaller version of himself. The morning briefings continued, but Hitler stopped asking sharp questions. He stopped challenging numbers that didn't add up. He let Krebs and Bergdorf manage the optics. He accepted injections from his longtime physician, Dr. Theodor Morell, a man whose Vitamoltin cocktail of stimulants was probably the closest thing Hitler had to a conversation partner in those final weeks. The Parkinson's tremor in his left arm, confirmed years later by Norwegian forensic evidence from a partial skull fragment, was more visible. The ruptured eardrum from the July 20th, 1944 bomb still affected his balance and his hearing. He was a man falling apart in a country that was falling apart around him, and the two collapses happened at exactly the same speed. Meanwhile, just outside the bunker, the rest of the regime kept performing. Propaganda Minister Joseph Goebbels, who had moved his wife Magda and their 6 children into the upper shelter on April 22nd, kept broadcasting radio messages about total defense and werewolf guerrilla resistance, a fantasy of underground fanatics fighting on long after the official surrender. Martin Bormann, the head of the Nazi Party Chancellery, kept sending telegrams. The Bundesarchiv in Koblenz later preserved a collection of these, reference number N1128, file 45, and reading them is a surreal experience. They're frantic. They're bureaucratic. They're typed in the language of an administration that has not yet received the memo that the administration no longer exists. And Heinrich Himmler, the man nominally in command of Army Group Vistula since April 21st, was by April 27th physically somewhere else entirely, conducting separate negotiations through Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross with the Western Allies behind Hitler's back. But that's a story for another day. Hitler wouldn't find out about that betrayal until the evening of April 28th. So here's where we are, friends. It's the afternoon of April 27th. Hitler has just said, everything is lost. The room has gone quiet. Outside, the artillery is getting closer. The bunker smells like diesel and old coffee. Eva Braun is in the small room next to his study, probably reading or maybe just sitting. Sources disagree on what she did in those hours. Goebbels is somewhere in the Vor bunker with his family. Bormann is typing. The generals are pretending to plan. And somewhere to the north, Felix Steiner is doing nothing at all because there is nothing to be done. This is the moment the war became a countdown. Every hour after this point in the bunker is not strategy. It's biography. It's psychology. It's the slow ceremonial performance of an ending that everyone in the room can feel, but nobody in the room is allowed to name. Tomorrow, on April 28th, things get stranger. A wedding will happen. A betrayal will be discovered. A man named Fegelein will be dragged into the bunker in civilian clothes and shot in the garden before midnight. But that's the next chapter. For today, just hold on to this image. A man in a chair in a concrete box, whispering that it's over, and a room full of people who heard him and kept working anyway, because in that particular bunker, the paperwork really did keep coming all the way down to the last page. If this kind of deep dive into the moment's textbook skip is your thing, hit subscribe and ring that bell. We've got 3 more parts coming, and they only get darker. Drop a comment telling me which detail surprised you most. I'll see you in the next one. The middle day of the last 48 hours is, on its surface, the strangest one. If you watched the last episode, you remember the tone. Generals pretending to plan, maps drawn in lies, a man in a chair whispering that everything was lost. April 27th was the day the strategy died. April 28th is the day the strangeness really begins. Because in a span of less than 24 hours, the man who had lost a continent decided to get married, discovered that his most loyal-sounding subordinate had been negotiating behind his back, and signed the death warrant of his own brother-in-law. The bunker that morning was a place where the ordinary rules of human behavior had quietly stopped applying, and where every familiar gesture, a wedding, a betrayal, an execution, was now happening for reasons that had almost nothing to do with the original meanings of those gestures. Let's start with the morning light, or what passed for it down there. There wasn't any. The bunker ran on dim yellow bulbs wired into the same overloaded circuits that fed the diesel generators, and the bulbs flickered in a rhythm that matched the distant thump of Soviet artillery. By the early hours of April 28th, that artillery had crept close enough that you could sometimes feel the building shake. Shells were landing in the Tiergarten, the great park that separated the government quarter from the Bend in the Spree. One shell, several witnesses later reported, exploded roughly 80 meters from the bunker's emergency exit, close enough to pepper the garden with concrete chips and to make the whole complex feel, for a moment, like a submarine taking a hit. People in the bunker that morning were divided into 2 rough categories: those who pretended the sound was far away, and those who had stopped pretending entirely. Both groups kept working. There was a kind of dignity in that, even if the work itself was almost entirely ceremonial. The biggest ceremonial act of the day had been planned in advance, even though it looked improvised to anyone hearing about it later. Joseph Goebbels, the propaganda minister, had spent several days quietly arranging the paperwork for a civil marriage inside the Chancellery complex. War conditions required a special dispensation. The local registry office in Berlin-Schönberg was unreachable. The city was cut in half, and the registrar who would normally have performed the ceremony was somewhere in a different district. So Goebbels found a man named Walter Wagner, a minor official in the local party leadership, who was willing to act as the registrar inside the bunker itself. Wagner brought a register book. Someone produced a typewriter. A small table was cleared in the map room off Hitler's study. And shortly after midnight, in the small hours that technically belonged to April 29th, but felt to everyone in the room like the tail end of April 28th, Adolf Hitler married Eva Braun. The witnesses who were there have left us slightly different stories, and the differences matter. Traudl Junge, one of the 2 secretaries who remained with Hitler to the end, said the mood was subdued. Joseph Goebbels and Martin Bormann signed the register as official witnesses, and afterward a handful of others, Hans Bauer, Otto Gunsch, Heinz Ling, Gerda Christian, drifted into the room for what was supposed to be a small celebration. There was no music. There was no champagne. Eva wore a dark dress. Sources disagree on whether it was black, navy, or kind of blue-gray. And when someone asked why she hadn't chosen something white, she reportedly answered that in their case, it would be better to burn the dresses later. The line has the feel of something rehearsed, the kind of joke you tell when the real feeling underneath is too heavy to name. Hitler himself, by most accounts, was almost gentle. He did not give a speech. He shook a few hands. He signed a piece of paper. And then the group dispersed, and the bunker went back to the business of trying to survive the night. But before the ceremony, in the small hours of the same evening, Hitler had done something else that mattered more politically than the wedding itself. Sitting at his desk with Traudl Junge, taking dictation, he had put his signature to two documents. The first was what historians now call the political testament, a kind of last will addressed to the German people and to history, blaming the war on international Jewry, exonerating most of his senior commanders, naming Grand Admiral Karl Donitz as his successor as head of state and Goebbels as chancellor, and denouncing Heinrich Himmler for treason. The second was a shorter, more private document, sometimes called the Private Testament, which left his personal property to the Nazi Party, mentioned his art collection and library, and confirmed his marriage. Eva signed her own short addendum around 4 in the morning with the now famous line, she would rather die with him than live without him. Both documents, along with the marriage certificate, were folded into 2 leather wallets, wrapped together in a steel ammunition container called an Iltis box, and given to Otto Gunch with instructions to carry them out of Berlin if at all possible. The original German texts survive in the Russian state archives, in a translation made within days of the city's fall. The carbon copies of Eva's testament are preserved in the German Federal Archives in Koblenz. Together, they're the closest thing this regime produced to an honest final statement, which is to say, even the honest parts are riddled with the lies the regime had been telling itself for 12 years. Now, while the marriage paperwork was being organized and the testaments were being typed, something much uglier was happening in another part of the city, and it was about to crash directly into the wedding night. The man at the center of that ugliness was Hermann Fegelein. To call Fegelein a complicated figure is an understatement so large it almost becomes a joke. He was an SS general, Gruppenführer, and he served as Heinrich Himmler's personal liaison to the Führer bunker, which in the late-war Nazi state was one of the more poisonous jobs a person could hold. He was also the husband of Gretel Braun, Eva's sister, which made him technically Adolf Hitler's brother-in-law from about midnight onward, although nobody in the bunker had time to think about that particular absurdity. By April 28th, Fegelein had become a liability. Witnesses later testified that he had been drinking heavily for days. He had not been at his post. He had been seen moving around the city in civilian clothes, which in the final weeks of the war was the kind of detail that got a person arrested, because civilians in the streets of Berlin in late April of 1945 were, by definition, either looters or deserters, and the SS guard detail in the Chancellery had standing orders to detain anyone who could not explain their presence. Around midday on April 28th, Fegelein was picked up at his apartment on Schlesisstrasse, somewhere across the Spree in what was by then a crumbling fragment of the city. He was partially drunk. He was not in uniform. He was brought back to the Chancellery complex under guard and held in a corridor of the upper shelter, the Bunker, while Hitler was informed. According to Gunch and Ling, Hitler's reaction was cold fury rather than surprise. Fegelein, when questioned, claimed that he had been preparing to lead a werewolf guerrilla band and that he was about to fly to Italy to meet SS General Karl Wolff for separate negotiations with the Western Allies. In the paranoid logic of the bunker, this was not a defense, it was a confession. Anyone who talked about separate negotiations with the West was, by definition, a traitor. Hitler signed the order for Fegelein's execution without much drama. The sentence would be carried out by a firing squad from the Berlin Guard Regiment named Kurt Eggers, drawn from SS personnel still considered loyal. Fegelein was given a few hours. He was allowed to write a short letter to his wife. Around 11 that night, he was led out into the Chancellery Garden, near the same shell crater that would be used a day and a half later for a different purpose, and shot. The gunshots were audible inside the bunker. The secretaries, who had been married off hours earlier in a ceremony meant to mark continuity and faith, lay in their bunks and listened to the man who had been their leader's new relative die in the dark. What made the Fegeline execution more than just a single murder was the context in which it happened. By the late afternoon of April 28th, Hitler had been handed a piece of intelligence that put Fegeline's behavior in an even darker light. A Reuters news dispatch, picked up by an SS radio monitoring station and forwarded into the bunker, reported that Heinrich Himmler, the man Fegeline served, had been conducting separate surrender negotiations with the Western Allies through Count Folke Bernadotte of the Swedish Red Cross. The intermediaries included SS intelligence chief Walter Schellenberg. Himmler, according to the dispatch, had offered himself as the head of a transitional government acceptable to the British and Americans, on terms that explicitly excluded the Soviet Union. In other words, the most powerful surviving figure in the SS, the man who had built the concentration camp system, the man who had been Hitler's faithful Heinrich since the early days of the movement, was trying to cut a deal that would have left Hitler exposed to Soviet vengeance, and that would, in any reasonable reading, have required Hitler's removal from power, quietly, diplomatically, perhaps with a pension in some sunny country, but removal nonetheless. Hitler's discovery of the betrayal, as reconstructed from the testimonies of Gunsch, Ling, Bauer, and several others, came in the small map room off his study in the late evening. Witnesses say he went very still. The famous line attributed to him, that Himmler had committed the worst betrayal of his life, is one of those phrases that exists in multiple, slightly different versions across multiple post-war memoirs, and historians still argue about the exact wording. What is not in dispute is the effect. Hitler ordered Himmler expelled from the party. He ordered Himmler's arrest, to be carried out by any SS personnel still considered loyal in Berlin. He drafted a passage for the political testament that named Himmler specifically as a traitor. The bunker, which had spent the day celebrating a wedding, was now operating under the assumption that one of the regime's most senior figures had just tried to sell it to the enemy. Trust, which had already been a scarce commodity in that building, briefly approached zero. For the bunker community, the emotional whiplash of that single day was enormous. In the early hours, there had been a wedding, a strange, muted, almost gentle ceremony. By midday, the brother-in-law had been arrested. By late afternoon, the most senior SS leader in nominal command of the Northern Front had been exposed as a traitor. By late evening, the brother-in-law had been executed. Somewhere in between, two of the most consequential documents of the regime's final hours had been signed. Traudl Junge, looking back on the day in later interviews, called it a wedding day where nobody could smile. She meant it literally. The combination of small private griefs and large public disasters, compressed into a single 24-hour cycle inside a set of concrete rooms, was almost beyond what ordinary psychology is built to absorb. The bunker community survived it the way communities survive any ongoing catastrophe, by breaking the day into smaller tasks, by focusing on the next hour, by refusing to talk about the long term. Meanwhile, in the rest of the city, the geography was tightening. Soviet forces of the 3rd Shock Army under General Vasily Kuznetsov and the 8th Guards Army under General Vasily Chukov were within striking distance of the central government quarter. Telephone lines to the Bendler block, where General Weidling had his command post, were intermittent. Food in the bunker had become austere. Tinned sardines, dry biscuits, weak coffee, thin soup from a small field kitchen set up in the SS mess area. Water pressure had failed. Bottled water was being rationed. Fuel in the Chancellery garage, managed by Hitler's driver Erich Kempka, was down to a few thousand liters, enough, as it would turn out, to do the job that Hitler had asked it to do a day and a half later, but not enough to power any kind of escape plan. The city was running out of everything except the willingness of a few thousand defenders to keep dying for a cause that the defenders themselves could no longer fully articulate. So where does April 28th leave us? It leaves us with a wedding and a betrayal, a signature and a shot in the garden. It leaves us with the strange image of a regime performing the rituals of continuity, marriage, testament, appointment of successors, while privately disintegrating into suspicion and execution. It leaves us with a Hitler who is already mentally somewhere else, who would in 24 hours begin the practical arrangements for his own death, but who on this particular day still had enough energy to sign papers and order killings and to believe, against all evidence, that the paperwork mattered. Tomorrow, on April 29th, the bunker stops pretending to be a headquarters and starts becoming what it actually is, a hospice. A dog will be tested with cyanide. Farewells will be dictated. The breakout order, the cruelest of Hitler's late decisions, will be issued. And the Goebbels family, in the upper shelter, will finalize the quiet decision that will take all 6 of their children into the same dark. That is the next chapter. For today, remember this. The day the Reich got married was the same day it executed its own family. The day after the wedding and the execution was the day the bunker stopped pretending. On April 27th, the war had been a strategic problem, and a man had decided he could no longer solve it. On April 28th, the war had become a family drama, with a marriage at dawn and a killing in a garden. But April 29th is when the curtain came down on something else entirely. The fiction that anyone in those rooms was still governing. What the bunker became on April 29th was a hospice. Not in the modern medical sense, with its soft lighting and its gentle conversations and its careful management of pain. In the older sense, in the medieval sense, a place where people who are dying are kept company while they die, where the small acts of kindness are almost mechanical, and where every cup of tea or spoonful of soup is really a way of saying goodbye without using the word. The morning routine, what was left of it, began late. Hitler had not slept well by any account, and several witnesses suggest he slept not at all, lying on the sofa in his study with a blanket over his knees and the bunker shaking around him at intervals. Eva Braun had retreated to her small room next door. The secretaries, Traudl, Junge, and Gerda Christian, were still in their narrow bunks in the secretaries' quarters. Ling, the valet, made tea. The diesel generator coughed. A shell landed somewhere close. And somewhere in the bunker above, the Goebbels children were being kept quiet by their mother, in a way that families keep children quiet when they sense the adults are dealing with something they are not allowed to understand. By late morning, a strange errand had been arranged. Someone, the exact person varies depending on whose testimony you trust, suggested that the cyanide capsules should be tested. Not tested in a laboratory, because there was no longer a laboratory. Tested on a dog. Hitler's dog. A German shepherd named Blondie, who had been with him for years, who had slept on the rug in his study in the Berghof and in the Reich Chancellery apartment, and now in the bunker itself. The logic was straightforward and horrible. The capsules had been supplied by the SS pharmacy, supposedly from the same batch that had been prepared earlier for higher purposes. If they worked, they worked. If they didn't, the bunker community needed to know before relying on them. And if a dog had to die to provide that knowledge, then a dog would die, because the moral universe inside that bunker no longer drew a useful line between a dog and a person. A sergeant named Fritz Tornoff, who served as a dog handler attached to the SS escort detachment, carried out the test. He crushed a capsule into a piece of meat. Blondie ate it. Several sources, Junge, Gunsch, Ling, Tornoff himself in post-war statements, describe what happened next in slightly different tones, but with the same essential picture. The dog became distressed within seconds. Her body stiffened. Her breathing changed. Inside perhaps 90 seconds, she was dead. Some of the puppies from a previous litter were also given capsules to confirm the result. They died faster. The adults stood around and watched. There is no record of anyone speaking during the test. There is no record of Eva Braun being present, although she must have known. There is, in several testimonies, a small detail that may matter. Hitler did not watch. He stayed in his study while the test was performed. He accepted the result when it was reported to him. He did not ask for details. The afternoon, by contrast, became an odd ceremony of giving. Hitler had begun to distribute his personal effects in a manner that witnesses described as almost paternal, in the way a patriarch divides a household silver before a long absence. Except the absence in question was not a long absence, but a permanent one. Eva received several pieces of jewelry, including a brooch that had belonged to his mother. The secretaries received small gifts, framed photographs, a portrait miniature for Gerda Christian, a small gold item for Constanze Manzieli. The adjutants were entrusted with last duties. Gunch was given custody of the Iltis ammunition box that held the marriage certificate and the two testaments, with instructions to attempt to carry the documents out of Berlin and eventually deliver them to Donitz at Flensburg. Ling was given Hitler's pistol, a Walther PPK, in 7.65 caliber. The gun was later transferred through a series of hands and eventually made its way into an American military collection, where it remains to this day as a quiet exhibit in a fort outside Washington, where uniformed historians take schoolchildren through glass cases of objects that once belonged to the people they are studying. There are also verbal bequests. Hitler dictated, in the afternoon, a short text that historians now call the farewell to the German people. It was meant to be a radio address. It was never broadcast because the radio infrastructure of Berlin was no longer in German hands. And even if it had been, the words would have arrived in a country that had stopped listening days earlier. Traudl Junge took the dictation in shorthand and then typed it up. The text is short, perhaps 100 words. It calls for continued resistance. It laments the sacrifice of the German people. It blames the usual villains. Witnesses who were present said the dictation was calm and pedantic in equal measure, with Hitler carefully correcting his own phrasing, as if it still mattered whether the commas were in the right place. In a strange way it did. The text is now preserved in the German Federal Archives in Koblenz, file ED 100-24, and it represents Hitler's last written act as a political actor. After this, he wrote nothing that survives. After this, he was only arranging the practical details of what comes next. There was also one more military conference in the afternoon, although by this point calling it a conference flatters the activity. General Weidling was consulted via field telephone from his command post in the Bendler block on the far side of the Tiergarten. Krebs and Bergdorf were in the room, along with the adjutants and the secretaries who were still on duty. Hitler asked questions. He received answers. He did not challenge the increasingly grim mathematics. He ordered the deployment of what remained of two SS divisions that history remembers by unfortunate names: the Nordland Division, made up of Scandinavian volunteers, and the Charlemagne Division, made up of French collaborators, under an SS brigadier named Kruckenberg, who would himself be wounded before the night was out. Weidling's private estimate, later communicated to Krebs, was that organized defense of the city could not last more than 48 hours. Everyone in the room heard that number, even if they did not acknowledge it out loud. By April 29th, Hitler was no longer making decisions that he expected to be carried out. He was issuing them out of habit, the way old men continue to organize their morning coffee long after everyone else has stopped caring about the order in which the cups are placed. The cruelest act of the day came in the evening, and it requires a moment of honest framing because what follows is ugly in a way that does not lend itself to easy narration. Hitler authorized, through Bormann and through Krebs, a breakout order. Not a general breakout of civilians, because by then there was no organized civilian population left to break out, but a breakout of the SS formations still nominally under central command, eastward toward a corridor where contact might be made with General Walther Wenk's 12th Army along the Elbe. The order did not include the Hitler Youth remnants, did not include the Volkssturm companies, did not include the wounded in the field hospitals or the civilians still sheltering in the cellars of the government quarter. It included the SS and select Wehrmacht units and a small number of party officials. In practice, it was permission for the men Hitler trusted most to save themselves, while everyone else in the city remained to be captured or killed. The breakout itself, which began in the small hours of May 1st, was a slaughter. Soviet troops were waiting. Artillery had been pre-sighted on the bridges. A few groups did make it through, including most of Kruckenberg's surviving French and Scandinavian volunteers. Most did not. Thousands of men who might have surrendered instead died in the first hours of May. In a street-fighting version of a cavalry charge that the world had moved past decades earlier. In the Bunker, in the same hours, a different kind of decision was being finalized. Magda Goebbels had, by April 29th, concluded that her 6 children would die with her and her husband. The reasoning she gave to the small circle that knew about it was simple and, in its own way, consistent with everything the regime had claimed to believe. The children could not be left to grow up in a world without National Socialism. The children could not be subjected to the mercy of the victors. The children would not understand. The decision was not made in a single conversation, but it was firm by the evening of the 29th. The method was the same capsules that had been tested on Blondie. The timing was later, on the evening of May 1st. But the moral weight of the decision was sitting in the upper shelter throughout the day, in the form of 6 small bodies moving quietly between rooms, unaware that their futures had already been written. Back in the lower bunker, Hitler and Eva Braun had what would turn out to be their last shared meal. Vegetable soup, potato salad, asparagus that had come from an SS supply depot somewhere in the city, weak tea. The asparagus, in particular, is the kind of detail that survives in memoirs because it is so incongruously gentle. People who were about to die were still being served asparagus by men who did not entirely know what they were serving. The two of them ate together in the conference room, with the secretaries nearby. Witnesses say Hitler was calm. Witnesses say he made no dramatic statement. They sat, they ate, they went back to their respective rooms. Hitler spent the next half hour or so alone with Eva in the small study in her room, doing whatever it is that two people in that situation do in their last private hours. The bunker community has chosen, by unspoken agreement, to leave that hour alone. The memoirs do not describe it. The transcripts do not capture it. Whatever happened in that small space is preserved only in the memory of two people who took it with them. By late evening, the practical arrangements for the next day were being made. Hitler summoned Gunsch and Ling and gave them instructions about the body. The bodies, plural, his and Eva's. He specified burning. He specified the location, near the emergency exit in the garden, where shell crater from the previous day's bombardment would serve as a kind of makeshift hearth. He specified the fuel, approximately 200 liters of gasoline from the dwindling supply in the Chancellery garage, which Kemke would later pour over the remains and ignite. The reason given was the reason that always mattered most to Hitler in the final weeks, the reason that influenced decisions large and small, and that ultimately shaped the choreography of his death. He did not want the Russians to find the bodies. He did not want his corpse displayed in a museum, or carried through the streets, or examined on a slab by foreign doctors. He had been shown newsreel footage of what had happened to Mussolini's body in Milan just days earlier, and the lesson he drew was not the one most people would have drawn. The lesson he drew was that this must not be allowed to happen to him. It must be made impossible to happen to him. The bodies must be reduced to something the enemy could not easily identify, and the evidence that the world would later spend decades arguing about must be deliberately destroyed. It was, in its way, the last operational order he gave as a head of state. It was about the management of evidence. It was about controlling the afterlife. The last photograph of Adolf Hitler and Eva Braun together was taken in the conference room in the late evening of April 29th by one of the adjutants. It is a quiet, weary image. They are seated. They look tired. There is no triumph in their faces, no theatrical pose, no suggestion that they understood the cameras of history were about to focus on them. It looks like what it was, two people at the end of a long and terrible day, waiting for the morning. The bunker that night was not entirely quiet. Soviet shells were still landing in the garden. The diesel generators were still coughing. The ventilation was failing, and the smell of fumes was beginning to compete with the smell of cold coffee and damp concrete. In the Vor bunker, the Goebbels children would have been put to bed in their small bunks, watched over by parents who had already decided that those bunks would never be slept in again. In a lower bunker, Hitler's final private hours were ticking down. Tomorrow, in the early afternoon, he would step out of his study for the last time, take leave of the secretaries and the adjutants, walk back into the room where his future wife was waiting, and close the door behind him. The rest is the next chapter, and it will be told in its own time. For now, April 29th is done. The hospice has done its work. The farewell has been dictated. The fuel has been measured. The dog has been tested. The asparagus has been eaten. The children in the upper shelter have been kissed good night by parents who already knew. The morning of April 30th arrived in the bunker the way mornings have been arriving for weeks. Without sun, without birdsong, without any of the small, natural cues that tell a human body the day has begun. There is only the same dim yellow light, the same distant thump of artillery, the same rattle of the ventilation system laboring against fumes it was no longer built to clear. Hitler slept late, perhaps until 11 o'clock, and the valet Heinzling later described the sleep as deep and exhausted, the sleep of a man whose body had finally stopped pretending it had somewhere to be. Eva Braun slept in her small adjacent room. The secretaries were already up, moving quietly between the kitchen area and their typewriters. Somewhere in the Bunker above, the Goebbels children were being kept still by their mother, in a way that mothers keep children still when the adults around them have stopped talking in normal voices. A small breakfast was brought to Hitler in his study. Apple juice, which had become a habit of his final months, and a biscuit or two, and weak coffee. He ate, or did not eat. Accounts differ on whether he finished anything that morning. Then, around noon, there was a final military briefing, though the word briefing flatters what took place. General Krebs came in with his maps and his colored pencils. General Bergdorf stood nearby. The telephone link to General Weidling's command post on the far side of the Tiergarten was still working, intermittently. Hitler asked questions and received answers. He did not challenge the increasingly thin numbers. He did not demand impossible counterattacks. He asked, listened, nodded, and let the men leave. By noon on April 30th, the man who had once dictated the movements of armies across a continent was receiving his war in summary form, as a passenger might receive a weather report about a country he would never visit. Around 1 o'clock, a small lunch was laid out in the conference room. Hitler, Eva, Goebbels, the secretaries who were still on duty. The asparagus was gone. It had been a one-day luxury from an SS-supplied depot somewhere in the ruined city, but there was soup and bread and tea. Witnesses who survived to describe the scene agreed on its strangeness. There was no drama. There was no theatrical last meal, no speech, no moment that announced itself as a moment. Hitler was polite. He made small talk. He asked after the secretaries' families, after their plans, in a way that sounded almost paternal and that several of the women later described as the most unsettling thing he had ever done to them, because it implied he had been watching them as people all along and not only as furniture. Eva ate quietly. Goebbels said little. The lunch ended. Eva went back to her room. Hitler went back to his study. Around 2 o'clock, Hitler emerged into the corridor of the lower bunker to take his leave of the people who had stayed with him. The group was small. Traudl Junge had already been sent away, slipping out in the early morning hours with a small bag and a typed farewell from the man whose last words to her had been a request that she help the survivors. Gerda Christian and Constanze Manzili were still there. Heinzling was there. Otto Gunsch was there. Hans Bauer, Hitler's longtime pilot, was there, having refused every opportunity to fly out. General Wilhelm Monk, who commanded the central sector of the city's defense and who would lead the breakout attempt that night, was there. The adjutants, a handful of others. Hitler shook hands. He thanked them for their service. He said, in slightly different wording, depending on whose memoir you trust, that the war was lost, that he would stay in Berlin, that he would end his own life rather than be taken, that he wished he could have given them a better ending. Then he turned and went back toward his study, where Eva was waiting. What happened next is the part of the story that has been told and retold, filmed and reenacted, argued over by generals and pathologists and historians for almost 80 years. The accounts converge on the broad outline and diverge on the small details in ways that matter to specialists and that, for most purposes, do not change the central fact. Around 3:30 in the afternoon, a single gunshot was heard by the people standing in the anteroom outside the study door. Ling and Gunsch, who had been instructed to wait, waited for what they had been told was a specific interval, a minute, perhaps two, and then opened the door. The smell of bitter almonds reached them immediately. Eva Braun was on the sofa, her legs drawn up, no visible wound, dead of the cyanide capsules that had been tested on Blondie the day before. Adolf Hitler was slumped on the small sofa beside her, a bullet wound visible under his right cheekbone, a Walther pistol on the floor near his hand. He was dead. The time, recorded by multiple witnesses, was approximately 1530. The body disposal that followed was the practical conclusion of an order Hitler had given the night before. Erich Kempka, the driver who had managed the Chancellery's dwindling fuel supply for weeks, carried roughly 200 liters of gasoline up from the garage in cans. The bodies were carried out through the bunker's emergency exit and laid in a shell crater in the Chancellery garden, not far from where Fegelein had been shot 30 hours earlier. The fuel was poured over them. The fire was lit. For the next several hours, from mid-afternoon into the early evening, the bodies burned while SS guards held off Soviet patrols who had begun probing the government quarter. Witnesses later disagreed on how completely the bodies were destroyed. The Soviets, who would reach the garden within days, would recover a jaw fragment with dental bridges, a few bone fragments, and dental work that allowed positive identification. The rest was reduced to ash and memory. While the fire was still burning in the garden, the bunker community began to break apart. The breakout order that had been issued the night before was now the only way out for anyone who intended to survive. Around 10 o'clock that evening, Martin Bormann sat at the bunker radio and transmitted a brief telegram to Grand Admiral Karl Donitz at Flensburg, informing him that the Führer was dead and that the will of April 29th appointed him as the new head of state. The message was brief, formal, and almost absurdly bureaucratic for the occasion. It marked, in its way, the official end of the Third Reich as a state actor, even though nobody on the receiving end was yet in a position to act on the information. In the early hours of May 1st, between 4,000 and 5,000 people attempted to break out of central Berlin in several columns, moving through the Soviet lines toward the southwest, where General Walther Wenck's 12th Army was supposed to be holding a corridor along the Elbe. Wenck's army was itself disintegrating. The corridor was a fiction. The breakout was a slaughter. Soviet artillery had been pre-sighted on the bridges. Machine guns covered the cross streets. A few groups made it through. Most did not. Martin Bormann, the man who had sent so many telegrams from the bunker that he was sometimes described as Hitler's shadow, was last seen alive near the Weidendammer Bridge. His body would be identified in West Berlin in 1972 through dental comparison with records preserved in the Federal Archives, and the identification would be confirmed by DNA analysis in 1998. He was 45 years old. General Monk, leading a central group, made it through with a handful of survivors and surrendered to American forces a few days later. General Weidling, the defender of Berlin, surrendered formally to General Vasily Chukov in the early morning of May 2nd. The war in Europe would officially end 6 days after that, in a schoolhouse in Berlin where the instruments of surrender were signed in the small hours of May 9th. The deaths that followed Hitler's own were the closing chord of the bunker story. On the evening of May 1st, in the Vor bunker, the 6 Goebbels children, Helga, Hilda, Helmut, Hold, Hedda, and Heidrun, ranging in age from 4 to 12, were given morphine injections by an SS dentist named Helmut Kunz to render them unconscious, and then cyanide capsules to end their lives. The children's deaths occurred over a period of roughly 2 hours. Their mother Magda had decided, with the agreement of their father Joseph, that the children would not be left to grow up in a world without the regime that had defined their family's existence. Joseph and Magda Goebbels then walked up the stairs from her bunker into the Chancellery garden, left the building for the last time, and each shot themselves, Joseph with a pistol held to his temple, Magda with one to the back of her head. Their bodies were partially burned, but not fully, and the Soviets recovered them largely intact within 48 hours, along with the bodies of the children. The autopsies, preserved in Russian state archives, remain among the most disturbing documents of the 20th century. After the bodies and the telegrams and the fire in the garden, what remained was not a state, but a question. Who exactly had died? How had he died? What did it mean that he had died? The Soviet forensic teams, operating under political pressure that produced its own distortions, initially concluded that Hitler had died by gunshot alone, suppressing the evidence of cyanide to preserve the heroic narrative of a victorious Red Army closing in on a desperate enemy. The British, working from the debriefings of Hitler's dentists and dental technicians, produced an account published by Hugh Trevor-Roper in 1947 that has been revised repeatedly in the decades since. The Germans argued for years about what to do with the empty space above the bunker, eventually opening a small parking lot memorial in 2010 after decades of political struggle. The cultural memory expanded outward in waves. Joachim Fest's book, Oliver Hirschbiegel's film, the Traudl Junge documentary, the novels, the plays, the endless reimaginings, until the bunker became less a place and more a permanent feature of the 20th century imagination. The last hour of Adolf Hitler was, in the end, a private event. A body on a sofa, a pistol on the floor, a capsule bitten into, a shell crater in a garden, 200 liters of gasoline, a small fire watched by soldiers. But the second half of that hour was the beginning of something much larger. It was the moment when the death became evidence, and the evidence became argument, and the argument became the long, unfinished conversation that every generation since has had to have about what the 20th century was and what it should be remembered for. The most careful historians have spent their careers trying to separate what actually happened in that small room on the afternoon of April 30th, 1945, from what the world has been telling itself about it ever since. The two are not the same thing. Understanding the difference is part of what historical work is for. Thanks for sticking with us through the whole Bunker series, friends. For episodes, for days, one slow collapse into a single afternoon. If any part of it changed the way you think about those last hours, drop a comment and let me know which one. Subscribe if you want more deep dives like this. Hit the bell so you don't miss the next one, and I'll see you in the next story.